Hola, Econ peeps. Got Module 9 today, the Keynesian Neoclassical Economics module. Before we get there, my son, he's 9, he'll be 10 next month, and he wishes to say hello.
Hi.
All right, buddy, I got to get started on my lecture. Okay, let's get my big head out of the way. Forgive my unprofessional garb today. I'm getting ready to mow the lawn here in a little bit, so I got to dress accordingly, right? All right. So today we're going to discuss the differences between Keynesian and Neoclassical economics. The reason for this is because most of our economic theory that we talk about in this class are based in a sort of an amalgam of these two theories, or these two economic camps, if you will, right? So, but there's also a lot of misconceptions out there, and I'm going to try to clear some of that out. So Keynesian economics, named after John Maynard Keynes, an English economist who advocated for a more robust role for government in the economy. They call this Keynes' law. I don't think that that's accurate. I think somebody just kind of made this up to combat the mischaracterization of Say's law, which we'll talk about in a moment. But nonetheless, demand creates its own supply. I don't think anybody really questions that. I think that's absolutely true, that if you want something, somebody out there will make it for you. Okay? And of course, firms produce output that they expect to sell. Nobody, neoclassical or otherwise, has ever argued, certainly no economist has ever argued, that firms want to produce output knowing that it won't sell. That makes no sense. That's not unique to Keynesian economics. That's just common sense economics there, okay? So Keynesian economics focuses on aggregate demand, right? The total output of the economy. Consumer spending, business spending, government spending, net exports, right? Those four components, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. Whereas neoclassical economists tend to focus more on aggregate supply, right? On production, productivity. There was a French economist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Say who made some interesting arguments that have been mischaracterized as supply creates its own demand. That's not what Jean-Baptiste Say was saying, pardon the pun. Right? That's not what was meant there. So essentially, my take on Say's theory is that you can't. There's no point in demanding anything if you don't have, if you haven't produced anything to generate the necessary revenue to buy it, right? In other words, demand only exists to the extent that you have been productive enough to derive the necessary resources to go and buy that. So your demand cannot exceed your level of production. That's essentially the argument Say has made. It does not mean that supply creates its own demand. That is demonstrably false. Just because you make it doesn't mean people are going to buy it. We know that from a number of failed products over the years. But it is fair to characterize neoclassical economists as wanting a sort of more hands-off approach to the economy, believing that it will eventually correct itself. And I think that's accurate. It will eventually correct itself. And we'll talk as we move through this a little bit about why I'm not sure personally, just my own economic thinking on the subject, why I'm not entirely sure that waiting for that to happen is necessarily the best bet. I do believe it does happen, and it will happen, but in the interim, I think there's some damage being done that can be hard to recover from, and I don't think it's necessary. So let's go ahead and move forward. So again, the idea of what Jean-Baptiste Say was suggesting is that you can only demand up to your level of productivity, right? Whatever you produce. Because presumably in that process of you producing something, somebody paid you money for it, and you can go take that money and buy stuff. And in the absence of being productive, that's going to be hard to do. Okay? Money does not grow on trees, and in the absence of earning it yourself, I'm not saying that there's not welfare and things of this nature, sources of income that are maybe not derived from your productivity. But generally speaking, that's one of the reasons why we do not count transfer payments welfare. Transfer payments is econ speak for welfare. We don't count transfer payments in our expenditure approach for GDP, output, aggregate demand, all that good stuff. All right. So again, Keynesians focus on aggregate demand, and of course, they're only going to make stuff they expect to sell. There's just nobody has ever suggested otherwise, and that is not unique to Keynes. This is not a Keynesian idea. That's absurd. That's an economic idea. Nobody ever in the history of economics has anybody suggested that a firm's going to go produce stuff that nobody wants to buy. Just absurd, silly. It is true. Now, the neoclassical economists believe that the factors of production determines a nation's output. But I think Keynesians break this down a little bit different, because remember, there's potential output where we want to be, and then there's actual output where we actually are. And the fact of the matter is, it's true. Factors of production do determine our potential GDP. Remember when we talked about the business cycle, there was that trend line. That was potential GDP. The last lecture, we introduced the ASAD model. We'll see a little bit more of that today. And in that model, we use that long-run aggregate supply curve to represent potential GDP. That's where we want to be. And it is true that the factors of production determine our potential GDP. But the actual GDP is determined primarily by how much demand there is in the economy, at least according to Keynesian theory, that it's based on how much demand there is in the economy. And there's an element of truth to this. Okay, I think that's fairly accurate. I don't personally have some sort of economic hang up about that. Unlike their claim that firms produce output only if they expect it to sell is some uniquely Keynesian thought. That's ridiculous. All right. So, according to them, real GDP is determined only by aggregate demand, not aggregate supply, and that's not false. That's not true. That is not true. Real GDP is determined by where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect. Okay, in this model. All right. So some of the things that you need to understand in talking about this: disposable income is your income after taxes. It's one of the primary. It is the primary determinant to aggregate demand, at least for consumer spending. Remember, aggregate demand makes up 4 components: consumer spending, business spending, government spending, net exports. Okay, so consumer spending is 2/3 of our economy, and it's the primary mechanism, the primary driver of consumer spending is disposable income. How much money you have after taxes? Okay. Remember, I talked about these gaps in the last lecture. An inflationary gap is when the short-run equilibrium is above potential GDP, right? That's when we say, you might hear some economists suggest the economy is overheating, right? Prices are rising because the economy is growing faster than we arguably think it should, okay? And then a recessionary gap is when it's the opposite way, right? When the short-run equilibrium is below potential GDP, right? Or in the model, inflationary gap would be when short-run equilibrium is to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve, and a recessionary gap is when the short-run equilibrium, which remember is short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect, and that's where we are in the economy. We want to be at potential GDP, but when that short-run equilibrium is to the left of my long-run aggregate supply curve, then we have a recessionary gap. And this is the business cycle RIT ASAD model, right? It's just like the curve going up and down. Now you've got this short-run equilibrium oscillating back and forth across long-run aggregate supply as the economy grows, expands and contracts, okay? Interest rate, as we talked about, this is the cost of borrowing money. For our purposes, it is essentially the cost of borrowing money. You could also argue it is basically the opportunity cost of current spending, because instead of spending now, you could have put that money in a bank and earned interest. So there's another way of viewing interest rates, to be sure. But for our purposes, it is primarily going to be discussed in the context of how much it costs to borrow money. And the primary borrowers in this case are businesses. The big thing that determines business spending is interest rates, the cost of borrowing, right? All right. So let's go through some of these. What are the big factors that affect consumption? As I said, disposable income is the biggest one. And then there's expected future income, right? Do you think you're going to have more or less money next year? That can certainly affect your consumption habits today. And wealth or credit. Credit, the ability to borrow cheaply or cheaper than others, relatively speaking to your level of income and whatnot. And wealth is not just simply how much money you have. Wealth is really the value of all of your assets minus the value of all of your liabilities, and what's left over, that's your wealth. So you want your assets obviously to be more valuable than your liabilities. And a liability to you may be money that you borrow. An asset to you may be the house that you want. Okay, that kind of thing. And again, when we talk about consumption expenditures, we're talking about households and individuals spending on durable goods, things that last a long time, like a car or house. Non-durable goods, for example, pizza is highly non-durable around Dr. Reynolds, all right, and other services. And again, disposable income is the primary driver, but also what you think you'll be making in the future can affect your current consumption habits. Also, your ability to borrow, your credit worthiness, as well as your wealth, because those two things go hand in hand, right? If you have homes, then you can use homes for collateral and whatnot. This is why the debate about taxes and stuff, and how much money Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos pay taxes is a little silly and misleading, because they're not paid traditional salaries like everybody else is. They got most of their wealth comes from the value of their stocks and bonds and assets that they purchased, maybe multiple homes and whatnot. And then the way they continue to have be able to spend is they borrow based on the value of those other assets. And this is the money you make from investments is known as capital gains, and it's taxed at a completely different level. There's an argument out there now that capital gains shouldn't be taxed at all because it is essentially double taxation. That's their argument, okay? And it's basically suggesting that because they only took the money that the government was kind enough to leave them in the first place and spent that and made more money on that. They bought a house and turned it over and sold it, right? So fair enough. But I think the overwhelming majority of even the uber wealthy folks would suggest you could probably raise taxes on capital gains and not be, not get in too much trouble. The problem is the people who have the money also are the ones who give the most money to the politicians, and they pay them to not do that. But if they're being honest, and it was really something, I think even they would go, yeah, we could probably pay more capital gains tax. It is taxed at a lower rate than income. But there is something to be said for that double taxation argument too as well. So, that's the nature of economics and the world we live in. It's never as easy or simple or cut and dry as we want it to be. Always a lot of nuance involved there. You just kind of figure out where you come down on that. Okay? All right. So, business spending is primarily businesses borrowing to buy new capital stock. Remember, when we talk about capital stock, we mean physical capital. Those are the human-made tools and stuff that we use to make other stuff. Machines, factories, trucks, that kind of thing. All right? And Keynesians focus on the expectations of producers as far as what's going to be influencing their decision to borrow and buy more capital stock. And this is a big part of what drives the economy is our capital stock, right? They do track growth in capital stock, and it's another one of those halfway, I wouldn't call it quite a leading indicator, but it's pretty close. It's right up there with productivity to me as a halfway decent indication of what the economy's doing, okay? And of course, interest rates play a significant role in determining how much businesses will borrow. That's why, we'll learn in the next unit, this is why the Fed is currently raising interest rates to try to make spending less, to make spending more expensive, to make borrowing more expensive, to reduce spending and bring down demand in an effort to try to bring prices down. We'll talk about that. All right. So here are determinants of aggregate demand. Remember, there are 4 of them: consumer spending, business spending are the two that are on this page. We can do things to affect consumption and business spending in both directions. We can do things that will increase business spending and consumer spending, and we do things to decrease both of them. All right. So what would be the things that would decrease consumer spending? And if you decrease consumer spending, you decrease aggregate demand. Remember, please, very important, this basic fundamental equation of macroeconomics. You have to know this for the duration of this class. All right, so here it is. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, and NX is X minus M. All right, net exports is exports minus imports. Okay, you have to know those four components. Have to do it. No way around it. Okay, for this class. All right, so I'm going to keep this handy because I'm going to use it later. So what are some things that we can do to reduce consumer spending, which is going to bring aggregate demand? It's going to decrease aggregate demand. Okay, we could raise taxes. If we raise taxes, that's less money consumers have to spend. Consumers spend less, aggregate demand is less. If incomes fall, that doesn't really work in this way. We can't affect aggregate incomes in that way, other than through inflation. You can increase interest rates, right? An increase in taxes is called fiscal policy. An increase in interest rates, that would be monetary policy. Okay, so you increase interest rates, you make it more expensive to borrow. That's primarily is going to be affecting businesses. Businesses borrow less; they have less money to spend. If business spending is coming down, then aggregate demand is coming down. Okay. There's one of the things that Keynes came up with that I think is pretty important is something called the paradox of thrift. Right? In our fairly simplified economy, and I think this is really quite accurate, we have two choices to do with our money. We can spend our money, or we can save our money. Right? Remember, our economy is, according to Keynes especially, it's primarily driven by aggregate demand. And if that means we need people spending money. And consumers, remember, consumer spending is like 2/3 of total output. When we talk about aggregate demand and GDP and output, you're really talking primarily about consumer spending. So, if consumers desire to save more, for example, higher interest rates. Another way that higher interest rates works, remember I told you that is the opportunity cost of current spending. Well, higher interest rates create an incentive for people to save, doesn't it? You're going to put some money away because the interest rate is accruing at a higher rate. So if you're saving it, you're not spending it. So that's another way that raising interest rates will decrease consumer spending. Not necessarily because consumers borrow less. That's also true. It's just not that big of an element in the grand scheme of a $20 trillion economy. But it certainly can create an incentive for consumers to sock some of their money away in an interest-bearing savings type account where they're not spending it. Okay? A decrease in wealth. This happens in the real estate market. It's happening right now. There's quite a bit of discussion right now that we are basically in a housing recession, and that housing recessions always precede a recession at higher levels, right? So now, not all housing recessions necessarily turn into full-blown national recessions, but chances are we're definitely headed there if we're not already there. Plenty of people say we're already there. We have had 2 consecutive semesters of less of decline in GDP. That's a rule of thumb, folks. That is not a hard and fast definition, absolute ironclad guarantee. It's just never has been. The only people who will tell you when you're in a recession, officially, is the National Bureau of Economic Research. They literally have a business cycle dating committee, and they date the cycle of the business, when it peaks and when it troughs. And if peak to trough is more than 2 quarters, more than 2 months, then sometimes they will argue that there is. But we usually, because these are such lagging indicators, we usually don't know we're in a recession until later. All right. So a decrease in wealth and a fall in future expected income. Some of these are they're stretching the limit. We don't have the ability. Those are all going to affect consumption, but we can't and will decrease aggregate demand. But we don't really have the ability to affect people's aggregate income except through inflation. We don't have the ability to decrease their wealth except with inflation, because the purchasing power of their money has fallen. And if we can make the stock market more volatile, for sure, we're doing that right now, you could argue, and that will decrease people's wealth. But generally speaking, those aren't government policies. Those are incidental to government policy, to be sure, as is a fall in future expected income. All right. All right. With regards to decreasing aggregate demand by reducing business spending, investment. All right. So if businesses, anything that causes their expected rate of return to fall, when businesses are deciding whether or not to borrow money or not, they're trying to decide, given that there's interest for this money that we borrowed, it's going to cost us money to borrow that money. Are we going to make enough from this money that we spend and presumably buy more factory space or more trucks or equipment, whatever? Is the additional productivity and revenue generated from this enough to cover the cost of the loan and make a little money? What's the rate of return for this investment, right? And if the expected rate of return falls for any reason, businesses are less likely to spend money. Again, increasing interest rates are going to affect businesses primarily, can affect consumers too, because they're going to stop spending money. The called paradox of thrift, as Keynes would call it. But it also means that higher interest rates means you're going to borrow less money. Okay? And so there's a drop in business confidence as well. All right. Then likewise, you can do pretty much the opposite of all of these things and increase aggregate demand. So you can decrease taxes, right? You can decrease interest rates. And that's going to increase consumer spending, increase business spending, just the opposite of everything we just talked about right now. Okay? So, and for the records, decreasing aggregate demand, that would be known as contractionary fiscal or monetary policy. If we're trying to make that happen, and sometimes we do, sometimes we're trying to grow the economy, and that would be expansionary fiscal policy or monetary policy, right? So contractionary and expansionary policies. That's really what they're talking about here. Although there's not really policies that are going to affect aggregate incomes, except for policies that create inflation. All right, that was for business spending and for consumer spending and business spending. How about government spending? Here again, contractionary fiscal policy would be to reduce government spending. If you reduce government spending, lower G, lower output, right? So anything that makes any one of those four components decrease is going to make total output decrease. Ceteris paribus, as always, right? So if you cut government spending, you're going to lower G, lower Y, aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Okay? You have contractionary fiscal policy. Same with if you raise taxes, you're taking money away from consumers, they have less money to spend, lower C, lower Y, aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. All right? And you do the opposite of those things to expand the economy. You can increase government spending. There is a caveat when it comes to government spending that we will talk about later. It's called the crowding out effect. Okay, an argument that could be made that when the government, to the extent that increased government spending has to be financed by borrowing it, they cause interest rates to rise. This increased demand for loanable funds by the government, or you could argue that there's less supply of loanable funds because the government came and took some, however you want to say it. Either of those is going to cause interest rates to rise. And higher interest rates create a disincentive for businesses to borrow and spend, so you're basically crowding out private business spending. That's the argument. We'll talk more about that. Okay? But suffice to say that, ceteris paribus, you increase government spending, higher G, higher Y, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. Okay? Now for net exports. if there is less demand by foreign consumers, in other words, if they don't want American goods as much, or if prices are higher, if prices go up in the U.S., then our goods just got more expensive relative to other goods, usually domestically produced goods. So either of those things, either if foreign consumers are demanding less U.S. goods, or our goods have just gotten more expensive relative to their goods, either of those things are going to make net exports smaller. And that's because net exports is exports minus imports, and if foreign consumers want less of our goods, then there's less exports going out. Lower X. So we're subtracting M from a lower X, and that's what gets this decrease in aggregate demand, a leftward shift, right? So, and then again, you could, if foreign consumers demand more of our stuff, exports is going up. Higher X, subtracting M, means net exports is increasing. Right? Economy is growing. It's going to increase aggregate demand, rightward shift of our AD curve. Okay, if prices drop in the U.S., makes our goods less expensive relative to their goods, and they're going to demand more of ours. Okay, all right. So Keynesian analysis is based, at least in part, on this idea of a coordination argument that says this. Listen, this idea of sticky prices is a really important one in the context of this particular module. Right? I told you at one point that the truth of the matter is some firms are slower to change their prices because there's a cost associated with changing their prices. Right? For example, menu cost, second from the bottom there. Right? There is a cost associated with firms changing their prices. So because of that, Keynes argues that the prices and wages are not very flexible, even in the short run, specifically in the short run, and that it does not require perfect information. Nobody has perfect information. If that was the standard, we could never change prices and wages. So it doesn't require perfect information, but we have less good information about the level of compensation that laborers and other people in the market are willing to accept. But that, again, stickiness is not universal. It's not one size fits all, and it is not mutually exclusive to prices changing, because this is aggregate demand we're talking about here. All right, and some goods are less sticky than others. Some aren't that sticky at all. Gas prices don't seem to get very stuck, do they? They seem to change quite freely all day and on a week-to-week basis. So, and there's also a context. Not all prices are always sticky or as sticky as they had been in other circumstances. There's something to be said. It is true that we won't have perfect information, but that will never be a standard that we could ever abide by. We will never have perfect information. The expenditure multiplier is hugely important. This is really important. What Keynes is arguing here is that because, let's say consumers, we cut taxes, okay? And consumers have more money. Well, they take that share of that additional income they now have from disposable income is greater because taxes went down. And remember, disposable income is income after taxes. So if you reduce taxes, they have more in disposable income. They take that additional share of this income and they spend some of it and save some of it. Now, the share of that part of that additional income that they spend is known as the marginal propensity to spend, or the marginal propensity of spending, all right, MPS. And then that part of it they save, or MPC, marginal propensity of consumption, because MPS is marginal propensity of to save. All right? So that share of that money that they spend, they go spend that somewhere. Well, whoever they spend that with, whatever store they go to and buy stuff with that additional income that they didn't save, the person who got that, they now have more money than they did. And they're going to spend some of that and save a smaller fraction of that. And then whoever they spent that money is going to take that money and spend it. So there's a multiplier effect when it comes to spending. All right? So anything that causes a change in GDP, spending increase or decrease, if you change any one of those four components, consumer spending, business spending, government spending, net exports, you change aggregate demand, output, by even more. Okay? That will always be the case. All right? change in autonomous spending. Don't get too bogged down in the wording here. But any sort of change in CIG or NX will produce an even greater change in output, in Y or AD, whatever you want to call it, GDP. Right? All right. Yeah, not too worried about macroeconomic externalities. I hadn't heard of it being used in this context, but it's fine. But I'm not going to deal with a lot of that. We did talk about menu cost. That is an important idea. It costs money to change your prices. That's why some prices and wages get stuck, because it costs money to change them. All right. And so sticky wages and prices is defined as a situation where wages and prices do not fall in response to a decrease in demand. That's why we said the aggregate supply curve. Remember, we said there were three of them. There's the immediate aggregate supply curve, which is largely horizontal. And that is because initially aggregate changes in the prices, the price in the aggregate, change in the aggregate price level does not immediately affect aggregate supply. But as time goes on, more and more goods will become to adjust to this higher price, and slowly but surely that aggregate supply curve, the immediate short-run aggregate supply curve, will start to rotate and start its upward sloping to where eventually it becomes perfectly vertical in the long run. And so we have this long-run average supply curve. That is what happens eventually when everything is flexible. All prices and wages can be changed. Okay? But the sticky wage and price does not apply to every single good or service. The level of stickiness depends. It depends on the market. It depends on the industry. It could depend on the region. And it can depend on the context. What's the condition of the economy in which this change in the aggregate price level occurred, right? All right. Keynesian economics focuses on explaining why recessions and depressions occur. In other words, Keynes is focused on these sort of short-run contractions. What's causing this? The business cycle, really. And the Keynesian view of these contractions is based on two key building blocks. First, aggregate demand is not always high enough to incentivize producers to hire enough people to reach full employment output. Long-run aggregate supply curve is full employment output. Remember that, please. All right? It's not, and that's where we want to be. We want short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long-run aggregate supply to all line up. Right? All in the same place. When that happens, we're at full employment output. And that's what they're saying here. The problem is aggregate demand is not always high enough to provide firms and enough of an incentive to hire enough people to reach full employment output. All right? And again, hiring is going to be based on demand. The more you demand, the more people they need to produce it. It's just that simple. All right? The macroeconomy may adjust only slowly to shifts in aggregate demand because of sticky price. That one we've been talking about. Okay? All right. Let's go ahead and move forward here. All right. So the original equilibrium at E naught, right over here, we call the E sub 0 as E naught. And that intersects, here's where the price level is at this point. All right. This is where the aggregate supply curve is. It's either here, or maybe it's here, or maybe it's, here's the long run aggregate supply, but maybe it's closer to this, right? But you get the idea. So, because this intersection is at where the long run aggregate supply curve happens to also be, we're in long run equilibrium. We're at full employment output, and then for whatever reason, one of those things we talked about. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, and in the immediate effect of this, prices are not going to change. They will eventually. If we wait too long, it'll happen for sure. Okay, and now we're in short-run equilibrium, but this is basically a recessionary gap here. The economy is contracting, and when the economy contracts, unemployment rises. Okay. Remember, unemployment moves in the opposite direction of output. So anything that causes output to change is also affecting unemployment. Okay, so in this case, with a leftward shift of my aggregate demand curve, output is falling, unemployment is rising. All right. And so anything we do to try to push that aggregate demand curve back to the right, we need to take into account the multiplier effect, because we don't want to just increase government spending by the size of this gap right here, because it's going to overshoot it by a mile. We want to know what the marginal propensity to save and consume is, so that we can determine just exactly how much we need to increase government spending by, so that the multiplier effect will kick in and move it out there. Right? Now, ceteris paribus is not a real thing, and while we're trying to wait and see get this to happen, other things happen in the economy and sometimes offset any progress we make, or perhaps makes it move even faster, and we end up with some inflationary pressure. So this is an inexact science, to be sure. I think everybody would agree that economics is at best a soft science. All right. The belief is that some small change in economic activity in that cycle, it will push repeatedly through the economy and have a larger impact than the initial dollar amount spent. And I think this has been proven to be pretty accurate. Okay, that this multiplier effect is a real deal. You have three multipliers at the macro level. You have a spending or a fiscal multiplier. Okay, you also have a tax multiplier, which happens to just be your spending multiplier minus 1. Suggesting that spending is more stimulative than taxes, but there's that catch. If it's government spending and they're funding it by borrowing money, they're crowding out business spending and so forth. Now, there's also a money multiplier. We will talk about these later. I don't know just how deep this book gets into those three multipliers, but I know they will mention some of them. And they're easy to calculate. It's not too hard. This is, like I said, the math in this class isn't, I don't think, prohibitively complex. It gets that way as you move through higher levels of economics, to be sure, but not at this level. We're pretty straightforward. All right, and then this change in aggregate expenditures is going to go through the economy. Households, it's a cycle. Remember that the how we had that circular flow model, right? So households buy goods and services from the firm. The firm pays its workers, and workers buy goods from other firms. These firms pay their workers, and so forth and so on. And away we go. Back and forth, right? This is the circular flow. Okay? That's all we're talking about. Now, please remember this spending multiplier. Right now we're going to define it as the ratio of the change in output to the change in aggregate expenditure, and what's caused the change in GDP. In other words, what is how much did consumer spending change by versus how much did change in total output change? The ratio of those two numbers gives you an actual multiplier. We don't need to know how much that will happen. We're going to calculate a multiplier that will then tell us how much do we need to increase spending by to close a gap of this size, that kind of thing. We'll get there. Next unit. Marginal propensity to consume is that percentage of a change in your income. What share of this additional income are you going to spend, and how much of it are you going to save? Marginal propensity to save. Or decrease. It can go in either direction. If your income falls, how much of that less income, that income that you lost, is going to be saved, and how much of it will be spent? All right. Marginal propensity, as opposed to your average propensity to consume and save. Marginal means changing that by a single unit. How much of that is going to change? How much more are you going to spend now that you have more money? How much less are you going to spend now that you have less money? That kind of thing. How much are you going to save now that you have more money? How much less are you going to save now that you have less money? Okay. All right, so here's calculating the multiplier effect, okay? And they do have something called the marginal propensity to import, right? This is just how much does your change in income affect how much money you spend on imported goods. Fair enough. You could apply this concept to any number of things. How about the marginal propensity to work or something like that? What's the if we increase incomes, how much more likely are people to go for those kinds of jobs? That kind of thing. So this is something you can really apply in a number of different ways. So how do you calculate the multiplier effect? So aggregate government spending increased by 100. We'll say $100. Just keep it simple. And we have a marginal propensity to save of 0.1 and a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9. Now, notice 0.1 and 0.9, or 10 and 90%, is 100%. Because all we do in our economy is we either save our money or we spend our money. The sum of these two marginal propensities, consume and save, has to be 1. MPC plus MPS is equal to 1. This is important, especially when we start calculating this, right? Because MPS plus MPC is 1. If we have any one of those, we can get the other one. Because all we need to do, for example, MPS is now 1 minus MPC. And MPC is 1 minus MPS. So if they give us any one of those, we can calculate the other one. All I did was basic algebraic manipulation, right? No big deal. We know that 100% of your income is going to be either saved or consumed. No way around it. Okay? All right. So, government increased spending by 100. We're saving 10 of that, so you got an extra $100. You're putting 10 of it in your savings account, and you're going to take the other 90 and you're going to spend it. Well, wherever you go to spend it, they now have $90 more that they didn't have before, and they're going to take 90% of that $90 and they're going to spend it, which is $81. So they put $9 in their bank account and they go in their savings account and they go spend the other $91. Well, guess what? Whoever they spend that $91 with, they're going to spend 90% of that, save 10% of it. So they're going to put $8.10 in their savings account, and they're going to spend $72.10, and so forth and so on. And this process keeps right on going. Right? And in fact, that $100 change increased total output by over $300, by almost $350, in fact. You see that? That's just the first 3 rounds there. You'll figure out how to calculate this at another time. Okay? All right. So this is what I was telling you earlier. Contractionary fiscal policy is efforts to decrease aggregate demand through tax increases or government spending. And expansionary fiscal policy is efforts to increase aggregate demand through means such as cutting taxes to stimulate consumption and investment, or direct increases in government spending. Now, here's the part the book doesn't want to say because it's political. But the reality is, almost always, you're going to have to do both of these. And I don't mean contractionary and fiscal and expansionary. I mean, listen, Republicans are not going to agree to allow the Democrats to increase government spending without the Democrats agreeing to cut taxes. And likewise, when the Republicans are in charge, they're not going to be able to get enough votes for a tax cut unless they agree to increase government spending and attract some Democrats to it. Generally speaking, that's just the way this works. Republicans aren't going to agree to more government spending without increases in taxes. Decreases in taxes, and the Democrats are not going to agree to a reduction in taxes without increased government spending. So, generally speaking, unless they've got a filibuster proof in both houses, I think you can filibuster in both. Filibuster may only apply to one, but anyway, you get the idea. Ask your government teacher what filibuster means if you don't know. All right. And a GDP gap, again, this is the difference between actual GDP and potential GDP, and it can be recessionary or it can be inflationary. You have those two gaps. Again, if the short-run equilibrium is in front of or to the right of your long-run aggregate supply curve, then it is absolutely going to be inflationary. If your short-run equilibrium, again, meaning where the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve intersect, if the short-run equilibrium is to the left or less than your potential GDP, then you have a recessionary gap. Okay? And the difference there, we just generally call those gaps, that's known as a GDP gap. How do you close a GDP gap, right? Well, if you want to close, you close a recessionary gap through expansionary fiscal policy, and you close an inflationary gap through contractionary fiscal policy. All right. Yeah, so when the economy falls into a recession, the GDP gap is positive? No, not really. I don't know why they would call it that. That's ridiculous. It's a recessionary gap. It's not a positive GDP gap by any stretch of the imagination, and the economy is operating at less than potential. Now, why do you want to say that less than potential is a positive? I'll never understand, but okay. And then inflationary, it's not negative. It just means that the economy is operating at greater than potential. It's overheating a bit. Recessionary, you have some resources being left idle. Again, if you're recessionary, means that you are that you have a higher unemployment. And inflationary means you typically have lower unemployment, but higher prices aren't fun. So, as we're all learning the hard way, right? All right, now let's move on to a more detailed discussion of neoclassical economists, which would argue that any number of economic perspectives that suggest that the macroeconomy is stable and that the government should not try to manipulate that tends to be more neoclassical. But generally speaking, I think you find when I first started studying economics in 07, 08, when I was an undergraduate at the age of 39, there was a lot of conversation. I remember a handful of people asking me, "Are you a Keynesian?" and that kind of stuff. And we don't really use those kinds of descriptors anymore. At that time, they had already fallen out of favor, and they were typically you were thought of as either a saltwater economist or a freshwater economist. A freshwater economist meant that you were at one of the schools that tended to be a little bit more conservative, and saltwater economists, meaning that you were at a school on the coast, and they tend to be a lot more liberal, or more certainly towards more Keynesian, and quite frankly, a lot more socialist. But UMass Amherst, University of Massachusetts in Amherst, is a noted big college for socialist economic training. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you shouldn't be, but if you are, go and stay there. So anyway. And then Say's law is not supply creates its own demand. That's just not true. All Say was trying to argue is that you cannot demand anything if you haven't produced anything, because it's only through production that you get the resources to go buy stuff. So it's not that supply creates demand. It's that supply enables your ability to demand. And because you're, as a worker in a factory, you're supplying your labor. You're producing something of value for which you get paid. And in the absence of you doing that, you probably don't have much room to demand anything. That's the argument. All right. Keynes argues that the macroeconomy is inherently unstable. And because of that, their normative position, that, remember, positive means factual, objective. Normative means opinion, subjective, right? So, they believe it is a fact that the macroeconomy is inherently unstable. And normatively, they say that because of that, government should step in and try to compel some stability on it, because government's really good at stabilizing things. Neoclassical economists, not that I'm opposed to government intervention, but we may take it a little too far sometimes, right? That's my concern. Neoclassical economists argue that it is inherently stable. And that any divergence from potential GDP and full employment is temporary, and they normatively hold that government should keep their hands off the economy, don't engage in macroeconomic policy making at all. So there are any number of camps, little neoclassical kind of branch out. There are monetarists, there are supply side economists, so-called Reaganomics. You may hear there's a pejorative that a lot of people hurl at supply-siders, say trickle-down economics. I don't have a problem with that. Listen, you can argue until you're blue in the face. A rising tide lifts all boats, period. End of story. Does not matter. That's just a fact. It's not a fact because we're capitalists. It's not a fact because I'm an economist. It's not a fact because we have the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, and we break these things into Keynesian and neoclassical. None of that has any relevance. A rising tide has always and always will lift all boats. And that's why the idea that trickle down has been proven, Reaganomics supply side has been proven, has been debunked. I hear that a lot. It's never been debunked. They just say that so that you'll go on. It's just not true. If anybody disagrees, let me know. Show me where it's been debunked. Provide me with the data. All right. Neoclassical is a view of, is kind of a merging of the idea that we have these new ways of thinking about the old classical model of the economy. Again, Say's law is not supply creates its own demand, but that you can't demand anything in the absence of supply. Without you producing something that gave you the resources to go buy stuff, you don't have any capacity to demand a thing. So their argument is every bit of output that is produced and sold, the revenue generated from that is equal to an equivalent amount of income generated, right? So your capacity to demand is limited by your production, how much you produced and made money for. All right? This idea of human capital is inherently neoclassical in nature, right? It's this idea that education, training, skills, that is the basis upon which we determine your value in the labor market. I'm not talking about your intrinsic human value. I'm assuming that you're a valuable human being. I just mean in terms of how the labor market values what you can do for them. All right? If you want to know why, like I said before, why dropping cold fries in hot grease does not make a lot of money, people who do that work in fast food restaurants. That's because it requires no real education, training, or skill. There's no real education, training, or skill required to do that. Everybody can be taught that just about. All right? The natural rate of unemployment. This is the rate of unemployment that you get in the long run. This is what full employment output means. That at that point you're at the natural rate of unemployment, and it means there's no cyclical. So you're only talking about frictional unemployment and structural unemployment, if you'll remember from that chapter. Neoclassical perspective is that the economic activity is determined primarily by aggregate supply, right? Because again, they're only producing what you have the money to buy. So that's where that comes from. It's not supply creates its own demand. It's that demand is only created because something got supplied. Because you, the person who's doing the demanding, had to supply something in order to get the resources to demand anything at all. And then potential GDP is that level of output that can be achieved when all resources, talking about the four factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability, are fully employed. That's potential GDP. All right, two building blocks in neoclassical economics. In the long run, the economy will fluctuate around its potential GDP at a natural rate of unemployment. All right, that's the business cycle in the neoclassical system. Okay, and wages and prices do adjust in a flexible manner so that disturbances in the long run, prices are flexible. Okay, disturbances such as a recession or a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap always eventually return to its potential level of output. And this is true. This is true, and here's why that's true. So, if we have some sort of recessionary gap, what that means is that there's going to be less demand for their stuff, so they're going to have to lay off some people. Well, they're spending less money. There's less demand for interest rates, right? Less demand for interest rates mean that less demand for loanable funds for money means that. Interest rates, if you're not demanding money, interest rates are going to start to fall. Lower rates of interest incentivize business spending. So at some point, those interest rates are going to get low enough, the business is going to say, hey, this looks good. Now, because when you do that calculation for rate of return, you don't have to make quite as much money from this borrowed money because interest rates weren't as high. It's not costing you as much to borrow it, so your rate of return becomes a little bit easier to meet your goal, your expected rate of return. So it attracts businesses. They then start spending and it spins it right back up. Here is my problem with that. I think that's true. I think that will happen eventually. But in the meantime, we have a problem. All right? So the economy, starts to contract. Consumers spend less money. When consumers spend less money, output falls by even more. Right? So let's bring this up. When output falls by even more, well, guess what? That means unemployment is going up. Output fell, unemployment's going up. Well, guess what? if you thought the working people before this were spending less money, unemployed people spend even less money. And there we go again. Consumer spending falls by even more, causing output to fall by even more. And so forth and so on. And this is what we call a negative feedback loop. Right? It's just going to keep going down and down and down and down. Until eventually interest rates or whatever else might happen to businesses decide, hey, now it's a good time to get back in. And they will start bringing, the economy can start coming back up. In the meantime, you tell me what happens to people who lost their house, who maybe had their car repossessed. How do they go find another job now that they're homeless and have no vehicle to drive? This is why I don't think not doing anything is necessarily the best solution. And we did that for all the time prior to the Great Depression. I mean, that was Hoover's whole response to, you could argue that was Hoover's response, President Hoover's response to the Great Depression. He was president at the time that the stock market crashed in 1929. So, I'm just suggesting, I'm not sure not doing anything and waiting for the economy to work itself out, that can take a lot of time. And a lot of people get hurt waiting for that to happen. And the more damage you do, the longer it's going to take you to get back up. And the more damage you do to otherwise productive people who would be happy to be working if they could, but they don't have a car, now they don't have a home, so what are they supposed to do? That's the catch, right? There's no doubt that there's truthisms throughout both Keynesian and neoclassical perspective. And that's why most economists these days really put them together. You don't have saltwater. You still have saltwater and freshwater economists, but not the way it used to be. Most of us we borrow. We even got a little monetarism thrown into that. A little real business cycle over here, right? So we borrow from these pieces of it to try to put together our understanding of the economy, and that's going to vary widely from one economist to the other. There's a handful of things that weave their way through almost everybody's perspective. Supply and demand is just incontrovertible. I've not heard anybody argue that it's not. But ceteris paribus is not a real thing, and you can always undo and augment and counter effect these things. So anyway, so again, yeah, in the long run, because everything's flexible, they can potential GDP determines the size of the economy, and we're able to always return to that potential level of output on all by itself. I believe that's true. It just takes time for that to happen, and this isn't always some abstract, dehumanized idea here. There's real people being adversely affected as we sit here and wait for the economy to wind its way back up. So that's why I'm not necessarily a big believer in doing nothing. I think we, more often than not, we do way too much, and I think there's all sorts of other problems. But anyway, so really the neoclassical contribution to much of what we do is going to be the long-run aggregate supply, this crowding out effect I talked about. They sticky prices is more of a Keynesian thing, but there's bits and pieces wove through all of this, right? And one of their big contributions, long-run aggregate supply. Keynes did not have long-run. Keynes did not consider long-run. In fact, he was asked at one point, why no long-run? And he rather famously quipped, because in the long run, we're all dead. A cheerful old fellow, huh? Those English folks. So that's the weather over there. Anyway, So long-run aggregate supply curve, that's potential GDP, that's the natural rate of unemployment, that's full unemployment output. It's all those things, all right? The long-run aggregate supply, natural rate of unemployment, full employment output, potential GDP, all of those things, okay? How does the macroeconomy adjust back to its level of potential GDP in the long run? Because as businesses spend less, because consumers are buying less, there's less demand for money. Less demand for money means interest rates are going to fall, right? So it's just again, it's just basic supply and demand. There's just no way around it. And in this case, it's supply and demand of money. But as interest rates fall, it becomes a little easier to meet expected returns. And so they go, okay, let's do it now. And then when they do, they hire more people, they produce more, et cetera, et cetera. That this is where the idea that supply creates its own demand. Just by increasing supply does not mean that everybody wants to buy more of it. That's not ever what. I don't believe for a second that's what Jean-Baptiste Say was trying to tell everybody. I don't think that's what his theories were. I think he was just suggesting that we all have productivity and we have no capacity to demand anything until we make the money to buy it. And that's what he meant. Supply just meant your contribution to production at the aggregate level. So in the short run, even if, according to the neoclassical economists, even if prices and wages are slow to change in the short run, in the long run they are flexible. All right, they become increasingly flexible. Right, and that's really the big contribution. You could argue that that this is classical economics and neo-Keynesian economics, because Keynes had, beginning in the 70s, Keynesian economics had to undergo a significant change in its view and throw in this long-run view, and they started borrowing pretty heavily from classical. And for a while there were many that called it neo-Keynesianism, and I think that's really, you could argue that this is all sort of neo-Keynesianism, neoclassical, all these things put together. Neoclassical just means classical elements with Keynes. Neo-Keynesian means Keynesian elements with classical theory. So to me, it's all the same. All right. A couple of other theories that come out that through this, rational expectations, adaptive expectations. Adaptive says that people look at past experience and they will adapt their beliefs and behavior as circumstances change. And rational expectations suggests that the most accurate possible expectations about the future, the more accurate their expectations are, they make their most accurate expectations comes from getting all the information they can. That's a bad definition for rational expectations. Here's how to think of rational expectations right here. You ready for this? If businesses know the Fed is about to jack up interest rates, guess what? They're going to behave as if the Fed is going to jack up interest rates. And so by the time the Fed jacks up interest rates and that change in interest rates begins to affect the economy has already been in a completely different place because everybody expected that to happen, right? So the argument that rational expectationists would make is that the most effective policy is policy that nobody knew was coming. All right. Keynesian economists argue that the adjustment from recession to potential GDP takes a very long time. It doesn't necessarily take a very long time, but it can and has in the past before we adapted Keynesian sort of the idea that the government should be active in the economy. And so, there's the quote from John Maynard Keynes: "In the long run, we're all dead." And because of rational expectations, prices don't wait for something to happen. They try to predict it based on what's going on and adjust accordingly. And it changes the economy. Even without even without implementing the policy, the economy is still going to change in recognition that the policy is about to come into effect. Rational expectations. All right. So neoclassical economists would say that because prices and wages are flexible, there's no need to worry about positive or negative GDP gaps, recessionary, inflationary GDP gaps, because full employment is self-correcting. It will eventually work its way back. I think that's true. I just think that sometimes too much damage can occur in the economy, that return is slowed significantly by that damage. And if we can mitigate that damage reasonably, I think that's not an unreasonable suggestion that we do so. Neoclassical economists don't think we should be fine-tuning the economy. Fair enough. I don't. Fair enough. They believe that economic growth is fostered by a stable economic environment with a low rate of inflation. I think that's absolutely true. Completely wrong, completely wrong, completely wrong. Keynes did not say demand creates its own supply. They're just they're just more focused on aggregate demand. But that's not the same thing. Nobody is suggesting that producers are going to make stuff that nobody wants to buy. That's idiotic. Nobody has ever suggested that. And Say's law is not supply creates its own demand. It's not true. And most economists would tell you that. Let's see. So here's a nice chart that kind of compares and contrasts the two. That's something you might want to take note of, right? And so this brings us back to ADAS that we talked about in the last lecture, right? And remember, I said there are three curves. Well, you can put them all together, right? So they looks like that. Okay? So let's talk about this. There is a, on the part of the supply curve that is mostly vertical, or horizontal, right down here. This part of it, say between here and here, somewhere right in this range, they call this the Keynesian zone. That's the portion of the short-run average supply curve where GDP is far below potential, and the short-run average supply curve is largely flat, horizontal, right? And then the space between the Keynesian zone and where the long-run average supply curve is, or at least closer to it, we call that the intermediate zone, right? And the intermediate zone is just that place where GDP is below potential, but not as much as it is in the Keynesian zone, and that the short-run average supply curve is beginning to is increasingly upward sloping. Not vertical in the intermediate, but it's increasingly, that slope of that curve is increasing as it turns upwards, okay? So it's flat here because of sticky prices. Prices are, even though we've had a change in the prices at the aggregate level, there's not much change in in the immediate short-run average supply because prices are stuck. It costs money to change prices. We're reluctant. Maybe this is just a transitory price bump. Maybe we can wait it out. But no, by the at some point they're going to slowly begin increasing prices. Remember, this is the good price of all goods. So some goods are more sticky than others. Some businesses, markets, some regions perhaps, the companies are a little bit slower to adjust because of the cost of changing their prices. But eventually, that's going to happen. They're going to become flexible, and that's in this intermediate zone. And as that curve continues its upward trajectory, eventually it will be at the long-run average supply curve stage. Okay, so this is all three in one, and the long-run average supply, we call that the Neoclassical zone. That portion of the short-run average supply curve where GDP is at or near potential, where the potential output where the short-run average supply curve is steep. And that begins probably right in this range here. This is our Neoclassical zone right here. And then our intermediate zone is right here. And the Keynesian zone is right in here. Okay? The short-term Keynesian model is built on this idea that aggregate demand causes business cycles and causes prices and wages to be rigid. But they risk overlooking the long-term causes of economic growth and the natural rate of unemployment. All right, so that's the neoclassical contribution to Keynesian economics is adding this long-run view of things. And the neoclassical model, they emphasize aggregate supply, focused on the underlying determinants of output and employment in the markets. Okay, and that pretty much says it all right there. So there's there's 3 pages of review. You definitely want to be able to kind of look at that and have some idea of those questions. Otherwise, folks, that's all I have. Thank you for your time today. I know we kind of went long. We're at an hour, I think, right now. So I do apologize, but good, important information. There's 13 questions throughout this. The video alone takes an hour for you to answer all of them. It's probably going to be closer to an hour and 20 minutes or more. So, all right. So anyway, folks, be good, be safe, be kind. See you around. Let me know if you have any questions, issues, gripes, complaints, whines, moans, or groans. Please know that I am available Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 6 to 7:20 via the Zoom link that's embedded in my syllabus. You can go there and click on that or cut and paste that into your browser, and it'll bring up Zoom for you if you have it, and you can talk to me that way. Happy to have any conversation with you, address any questions or issues you have. Don't hesitate to reach out. Email's always good, of course. I'll try to respond if I haven't. If you sent me an email and I didn't respond, I do apologize. I get a lot, and sometimes they slip through. I just lose track of it, and I apologize. Don't hesitate to connect with me again. All right? Have a wonderful day, folks.